Okay, so hello and welcome to my webinar on writing literary fiction in the age of AI. Um, so, to introduce myself, I'm Joe Mungo Reid, and I'm a writer and tutor in creative writing at the Institute of Professional and Continuing Education at the University of Cambridge. I've written three novels, pictured just here, and I primarily teach on the MST in creative writing, also pictured here in some artful black and white photos. I suppose that with a subject as big as AI, what I should begin with is defining boundaries, offering a sense of the many areas of the topic that I won't be taking in over the next hour. What I won't be offering is a fine-grained considerations of the ways in which large language models produce writing, nor a definitive take on whether AI models will ever have the ability to outpace human writers. I defer here for a number of reasons. Firstly, I'm not a specialist in the technology. And secondly, I feel, and I hope to persuade you today, that the more interesting question about AI is not whether it can match or even exceed the work of human writers, which is really speculation at this stage, too liable to be overturned by developments in the technology, but whether matching or exceeding should signal an equivalency or an interchangeability between human writing and AI authored text. Spoiler, my argument is no. For those who'd like a more technologically based discussion of AI from a writer's perspective, I'd recommend Ted Chiang's articles for The New Yorker. I'd also like to highlight my setting aside of some of the ethical concerns raised by LLM writing. The data on which these systems rely includes the work of innumerable writers, in many cases obtained illegally. See Meta AI's use of the pirated LibGen dataset, for example. Always used, as far as I'm aware, without meaningful compensation for the original authors. This co-opting of creative and academic writing without concrete acknowledgement by corporations worth literally trillions of dollars is, of course, an outrage and a disincentive to the future production of the very kind of work that these models rely on. However, this will not be the primary focus of my talk today, although I do think it's always worth maintaining a bit of a cui bono when considering any uses of AI, a good policy going forward. So, to begin, this whole slightly surreal discourse is necessary, of course, because it's been shown quite remarkably that machines can produce novel creative literature. I'm sure at this point you're all thinking of 1845, when eccentric inventor John Clark of the Clark shoemaking family completed a machine called the Eureka, or the Latin verse machine, which generated original Latin hexameter with the simple turning of a handle. I'm afraid that I don't read Latin. Quite shocking for a Cambridge academic to admit that, maybe. But I understand that the verse produced was comprehensible on the whole and gloomy in tone. The machine was put on display in Piccadilly, and Clark was able to retire comfortably on the proceeds of its exhibition. I'm kidding, of course, right, that the Eureka machine should be where the problematic issue of non-human authorship really becomes acute. Compared to the computations of ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, it's relatively easy to produce a piece of Latin hexameter. The brevity and rule-governed nature of Latin work to turn the exercise into a sort of mathematics. And yet, maybe I'm also not kidding so much because what is the fundamental principle of an LLM beyond trying to lay one word in front of another in a grammatical manner? The philosopher Daniel Dennett spoke of a concept he called intuition pumps. These are scenarios which lead those to whom they're described to a conclusion via intuitive logic. I think of the Eureka machine as a sort of intuition pump because to watch it produce text is fascinating but also off-putting. The idea that those sticks and holes in paper should produce a poem of deep profundity is somehow absurd. One of the magic aspects of ChatGPT and all is that we do not crank a handle and hear the rattle of their machinations. Instead, the interface, the pulsing cursor that kind of suggests thinking and then apparently typed replies, mimics the kind of online chat communication with humans that we have all become so familiar with over the past 3 decades. It can be useful to gain back a sense against our great human tendency to anthropomorphize of the operation of machinery, the performance of functions. We are in an eerie place and we should not forget it. But I should get more firmly back on track to address LLMs and writing more directly. So let's skip forward 180 years from the creation of the Eureka machine to roughly this time last year when Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, posted on X. We trained a new model that is good at creative writing. Not sure yet how, when it will get released. This is the first time I've been really struck by something written by AI. It got the vibe of metafiction so right. From my position, the urge to dunk on Sam Altman here becomes almost irresistible because really, what do tech bros know about creative writing? Is Altman staying up to date on the latest field, reading Grant or the Sting Fly between meetings of the OpenAI board? The mention of the vibe of metafiction is all millennial cringe, right? And has the teacher inside of me wanting to school, please define your terms in the margin. And the story itself, the story he's talking about, was, well, fine. It felt like a derivative version of the kind of artfully wistful autofiction one might hear read flat-voiced at a literary launch journal party and never think about again. Furthermore, it turned out that the best bit of the story, the phrase democracy of ghosts, was scavenged from Vladimir Nabokov's not exactly obscure novel Penin. And yet there is a trap in this reaction of mine, I think. To assess the work on qualitative grounds begins to treat it as comparable to human-authored literature, to imply that quality is the issue, not kind. If we obsess over the work being bad or just okay, then are we right as saying that a better piece would see us meeting our own obsolescence? Some humility here is necessary, I think. The story was, after all, definitively better than the work of some human writers. Publishable maybe by a small US college magazine, though having received some fees from such small college magazines myself, I'm not sure that it would make the necessary return on investment for OpenAI. Whatever his credentials as a judge of literature, it was significant that Altman thought that the story was good creative writing and that others were impressed. Are we so sure that the technology won't progress to the point that the circle of people persuaded by its achievements won't grow? Furthermore, if the main problem of the story was its badness or its menace, then there is an almighty gotcha being set up, right? It doesn't take a great deal of imagination to foresee the kind of AI compositional triumph that could spread existential dread into the writing community. Were an AI story to be plucked unknowingly from the slush pile of the New Yorker, say, the boosters of the technology would see themselves vindicated. Such a gesture would apparently place an AI program on the level of accomplishment similar to lauded story writers like Zadie Smith or Yi-Yun Lee or Laurie Moore. In other fields, such things have already happened. In 2023, for instance, an entrant revealed that a winning image in the Sony World Photography Awards had been AI generated. What's there to say if one's concern with writing is merely whether it's good or bad? I believe, therefore, that it's useful to think back to the clanking of the Eureka machine with which we began, to focus for a moment on the process by which an AI story is produced. Quality, surely, is not the only issue, because creative writing is not just like mathematics, not a field in which work is so easily proven valid or invalid. As I must say apologetically to my students very often, for all we have installed creative writing within the university, its effectiveness, its very utility cannot be perfectly objectively judged because it is a field that is necessarily subjective to a certain degree, concerned with translating feelings, experience, the what is it likeness of being alive. This slice of subjectivity, I would argue, requires a certain amount of attention to context, awareness of factors beyond the mere words on the page. When thinking about AI text, I am often drawn to a quotation from Alan Bennett's play History Boys, in which Bennett's problematic schoolmaster Hector speaks to this kind of idea in explaining his love of literature. The best moments in reading are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things, which you had thought special in particular to you. Now, here it is set down by someone else, a person you have never met, someone even who is long dead, and it is as if a hand has come out and taken yours. For Bennett, or at least for his character Hector, reading is an act of communication, and thus presumably an act that requires there to be a communicator behind the words that a reader is taking in. It's not merely an expression of something correct or true, but the expression of something another person has felt acutely. And what if there is not another person at the other side of the text? Or if that other cannot be relied upon to think and feel as we do? What is ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini in this scenario? Perhaps the corruption of Bennett's metaphor is too easy. The hand of Frankenstein's monster, assembled gorily from disparate parts. Certainly not something it would be comforting to find grasping one's own hand. I also think of a couple of Jorge Luis Borges stories, Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote, and The Library of Babel. In the first story, the hero of the narrative, the titular Pierre Menard, resolves to rewrite Cervantes' Don Quixote word for word, informed by his own experiences living centuries after Cervantes. In the eyes of the narrator, this rewriting, though it doesn't change a word of the text, endows Menard's Quixote with profoundly different sensibility to Cervantes' original. A moral that might be gleaned from the premise, taken characteristically by Borges to an extreme degree, is that the writer on the other side of the work should matter. In the Library of Babel, on the other hand, an infinite library is imagined, in which the volumes on the shelves consist of a nearly endless series of non-identical books, composed randomly of different combinations of alphabetical letters and punctuation. In such a scenario, an almost unending number of books must be postulated to exist, including, in the narrator's words, the Gnostic Gospels of Basilides, the commentary on that Gospel, the true story of your death, the translation of every book in all languages, the interpolations of every book in all books. And yet, the very value of this unending series of books is called into question by their mode of random production. Though each volume is unique, there are a nearly uncountable number of similar volumes, which differ only in a letter or comma. The precise qualities of a book are determined only by chance. Without an intentional context for the creation, the existence of these books incites desperation in the inhabitants of the infinite library, who, knowing that the books have been authored by mere chance, cannot find true meaning in any of the works that surround them, nor trust in the ability of new books to create meaning, given that any work they create will only duplicate a random volume in the near endless shelving of the library. I'm sure that I'm not the only writer or reader to feel a sense of quite topical dread at this story, a feeling of unfortunate contemporary resonance as we enter an era in which, thanks to AI, there is more and more text guided by less and less human intentionality. Perhaps both stories may be thought of as intuition pumps. What they both establish is the sense that our stories must come from somewhere. Is it the same thing to read some words and feel that they are a precise summation of something that another person, living or dead, has thought, and to encounter those same words and know that they are merely some sentiment formed in aggregate by digestion of countless other works, born of no specific experience? I do not think that it is. But perhaps this is a little too sincere, a little too pompous for you, in which case maybe we should talk about showing off. Fiction, though we don't like to say it out loud, is a sort of personal performance. Just as we watch with anticipation and pleasure Daniel Day-Lewis become Abraham Lincoln on screen, never losing entirely the understanding and the pleasure that comes from the understanding that we're watching not Lincoln, but a man born in London 150 years after the 16th president. So we also read Lincoln in the Bardo, attentive to the way in which George Saunders is bringing Lincoln alive by use of his words, by deployment of his own very particular style. I suppose that I take issue with John Gardner's assertion that the most sacred part of reading is feeling the authorship of the story, its contingent nature, fall away until we are only appreciating the narrative as unmediated, as something happening to us. Instead, I would argue that the author is not exercising magic so effectively as to truly suspend their reader, but rather that there is a game happening. The reader is consenting, like a punter at a conjuring show agreeing to believe that a rabbit is coming out of a hat, to the preposterous idea that a writer is pulling a whole world, a whole fictional universe out of their mind. Of course, fiction is a sleight of hand, more wonderful, I would argue, for its own impossibility. I suppose what I'm saying is that there is some performative achievement in writing fiction. It's not just important that a story is conveyed cohesively, grippingly, but that the story is sprung from a human brain. To read Anna Karenina or 2066 or Wolf Hall or The Luminaries is not just to enjoy the work, but to revel in its creation, in the sheer accumulation of energy and thought that the book represents. In this, maybe, a novel has more in common with a marathon run than one might think. To watch Eliud Kipchoge complete 26.2 miles in just over 2 hours is not a wonder because there are no other means to cover a distance in that time. I could easily do it in a car, on a scooter, hell, I could even do it on a bicycle. It is amazing because such time is an achievement of one man, unassisted, a testament to the capabilities of the human body. Storytelling might be thought of as a similar feat to running quickly, I think. It's a strange idea, but the ability to extend ourselves empathetically, to imagine how others may think or feel, to place ourselves in shoes of those different from ourselves, is a profoundly human quality, a natural survival strategy, in fact, just like running. And perhaps fiction might be thought of as a gamification of that necessity. We once ran to survive and hunt, and we now run to test and wonder at that still extant ability. Similarly, to imagine how others feel, to speculate about how events and interactions will play out, is vital. More vital than running these days, probably, which has limited use in boardrooms and politics. And so we all have a stake in recognizing such things as essential, in admiring them as human qualities, admiring their determined exercise. I find myself circling that off-cited assertion of Walt Whitman's that I contain multitudes, an assertion that gains meaning from the boldness of what is attested, one person reaching out and trying to understand all those living around them. On the other hand, what to think of an LLM text in these terms, necessarily composed of the work of multitudes, a democracy of ghosts in ChatGPT's ripped-off phrasing. Where is the achievement in this, right? The source of awe, the prehensile utility. Of course, there's a caveat here, which is that wearing another's shoes is never so easy a thing to achieve. Whitman's phrase cannot help but imply speaking for others, and goodness knows, fiction writers are not immune to creating atrocities to this by this means. It's very possible to take Whitman's stance and write a series of terrible stereotypes that speak not to multitudes, but instead to one's own prejudices and blind spots. And yet, as Zadie Smith asserts in her excellent essay Fascinated to Presume, this is the risk with fiction. This is another test of a novelist's achievement. Does a book contain its characters within tropes, or is it an expansive rendering that pays heed to all the variety and potential of human behaviour in the world? Furthermore, on this note, are we to assume that LLMs, trained on what has been written already, would fare any better? Would present experience be presented untainted? I think of terrible recent stories regarding AI mortgage assessment tools trained on historical data sets, which were tainted by racial bias. These systems picked up the pattern of discrimination and learned to perpetuate it. Do we not worry that study of extant literature, still unrepresentative, still lopsided and whose experience is privileged, should be perfect training for a system to learn from? A human, at least, can make the choice to write against what has gone before them. At this stage, I imagine you're getting where I'm coming from. Texts by a human author are different to LLM texts in at least a couple of important respects. They're informed by the experience of that writer, and hopefully are a sincere attempt to translate something of meaning to a reader. And they represent an important achievement of empathy and world building, something that at its best is quite thrilling and inspiring to witness. However, you might object that this argument against an authored text is a straw man argument, because the real use of LLMs for creative writing should not be author, but rather facilitator or collaborator. What if we preserve all the agency and intentionality that I'm so attached to by having a writer plan a text and save some time then by having ChatGPT or Claude do the pesky work of getting the words written? The issue here is that the act of writing is not so easily delegated as the scenario might suggest. The novel, for example, is already a low-resolution copy of the world. We're trying to sum up so much in so little. Particular word choice, specific nuances of scene or speech are where the vitality of a story lives. Character and psychology are what make good fiction, and the success of these factors is not determined in planning or summary, but instead in execution, attention to the minutest ebb and flow of thought. Hamlet is indecisive, does not give you to be or not to be. It is only in trying to commit the idea or feeling to the page that the writer properly reckons with material. As essayist and novelist Joan Didion said, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see and what it means. As short story writer and novelist George Saunders has observed, the main work of an artist is that she tweaks what she's already done. Work on a narrative is primarily rethinking, and the writer's conception of their own material should have leeway to change and develop as the work goes on. This leeway occurs in making small decisions. For Saunders, the best fiction, considered in its finest details and refined and reworked, becomes an extremely fractal, nuanced expression of the writer. Speaking to aspiring writers, he says that a well-worked text comes to encompass you happy, you grouchy, you stern, you euphoric, you blurry, you precise, and so on. In this framing, the time spent on the work matters, the returning to it in different states essential. There's no shortcut to imbuing it with one's own psychology. And doesn't that fit with Alan Bennett's image of one hand clasping another? We're seeking to craft a sense of experience that will speak fully and truly to others. The benefit on concentrated work on a text, I would argue, is that it gains a sort of subconscious, an existence beyond our own awareness that is nonetheless worthy of attention. I think of literary critic Frederick Jameson's last interview given to the Paris Review, in which he reflected on the way he started his criticism by studying style on the page and felt, paraphrasing Hegel, that defects of style tend to betray defects of content. Everybody has things they can say well and things they can't say, and that of course has to do as much with society as with the writer's individual life choices. What's lacking in an artist or a writer is a clue that can lead you back to something in the writer's whole temperament, and also something in society itself. Such attention, such deep reading is only possible, of course, if the writer has done the work of choosing each and every word. It could persuasively be argued that most readers do not approach fiction with the same level of critical engagement as Frederick Jameson, but they might still feel a lack of authorial fingerprints on the text, surely, even if they're not so resolved to identify and investigate those lacking features. Jameson's approach points to the tiny scale on which great fiction may be studied, to the sense of good writing as vivid, multi-textured, as a thing that may be considered in the most minute details. A final objection might be that I'm still overstating the way an LLM could help with creative writing. What if it is a tool merely used to edit existing text? This, I will concede, is a harder question, and my answers are more practical than they are ideological on this front. I do think that having good human editors and first readers is sacred and irreplaceable. The most important aspect of the MST in creative writing on which I teach is the writing workshop, in which participants gain the chance to share their work with peers and consider how their words have landed, how what they wish to say and make readers feel has come across. Would one get the same authentic, careful reaction from pumping one's words into an LLM? Can one of these programs function truly as a gauge of emotional impact? I'm skeptical. Yet my real issue with having ChatGPT or Gemini edit one's own text relates to questions of efficacy. Writing advice is hard to generalize, and many of the key tenets of the genre hold only most of the time. If we are dogmatic in prescribing them, we risk travesty. Show don't tell, for example? Mr. Tolstoy, what about giving a precise example of these happy families who are so similar? Use active language? Mrs. Woolf, must you fill Mrs. Dalloway with so much passive voice? Avoid repetition? Mr. Carver, do you have to have your characters stutter and repeat themselves so much? One of my former teachers would talk about the need to review towards freakiness. By this, he meant that in editing, a writer shouldn't sand off the edges of a piece of work, move it towards what others do, but rather that a writer should expand what is particular about their project. In this way, I think the best feedback is highly reflexive, not just responding to a work with a familiar toolkit or with familiar expectations about what good writing is or what readers like, but by offering a map for revision which engages deeply with the writer's tendency, skills, and aims. Maybe we might be inclined to warn against, say, digression in a text, but where a text in the vein of Tristram Shandy is charming the reader through its use of digression, then perhaps our advice should be to ask for more of that digression. The writer Robert Boswell sums up his process of revision thus: I don't write to polish, but to permit the narrative to move away from my initial intentions, to become complex and strange, or at least not boring. I call each of these changing versions a transitional draft, and I don't quit until the story stands on its own hooves and turns around to glower, meaning that it's fully alive and no longer mine. The space for the text to turn and glower is not one I have encountered in my experience of playing with LLMs and editing. They tend to hit familiar beats in offering advice and struggle to truly differentiate the charms of particular works. So, what do I suggest? Hoping that have convinced you, hoping quite desperately that I've convinced you because I wrote every word of this like a tryhard, that human authorship is important. What should this mean in practice for writers and writing communities? Whatever I feel, the fact is that LLMs can write apparently creative text and may very well progress to writing text of such quality that we can't distinguish their work from the work of human writers. Surely, in that case, my academic arguments in favour of human writing will be irrelevant. Maybe, but I'd also like to suggest that the public's acceptance of AI fiction is going to depend on how the literary world responds. If writers and publishers are, as I think they should be, determined to uphold the value of human-authored texts over the productions of LLMs, then I think the wine industry might be an interesting analogy. There is also almost no conceivable gotcha that the expert critics of wine have not fallen for. From failing to detect a red wine that was merely a white wine covered with red food colouring, to altering their assessments of wines when they were told different prices for those wines, to preferring blind tasted £5 wine over £100 bottles. It might seem that when highly trained experts cannot reliably identify the qualities of fine wines, then the market should collapse. But the last I checked, the famous wineries of France were still in business, imperilled where they are imperilled by abstemious Gen Zers, not by questions of quality. This is because, of course, wine is not drunk contextless. There is a fulsome story and culture that surrounds wine. To buy and open a bottle is a particular experience. Consumers actually want to be drinking wine from a picturesque vineyard in operation since the Middle Ages. They want to believe in a production process that is integrated into the history of a place and the culture of the place in which the wine is produced. And even if the effects of making the wine traditionally, slowly, cannot always be tasted by experts trapped in laboratory conditions, that does not mean that those aspects of the wine are not important or perceptible on the right terms. The old techniques do render a complexity that makes the study of wine rewarding, even if that complexity cannot always be identified in comparison to simpler mass market products. Similarly, advocates of human writing should make the case not just for the quality of the text itself, but for the social and cultural ecosystem in which surrounds the production of that text. If we only cared for how the average consumer tasted wine in the bottle, then vineyards which produce small volumes via painstaking techniques would go bankrupt. Yet via a combination of branding, customer discernment, state support, that possibility is being precluded. A focus on process and an emphasis on the fact that what is produced is not just a product is essential. European protection labelling, for instance, has worked to protect the production and distinctiveness of countless wines and foods which would otherwise risk being crowded out by other producers cutting corners to save a few cents. In this way, the Society of Authors' proposal of a human-authored scheme, in which books written without AI are branded with a human-authored sticker, is a move in the right direction. Making clear that LLM-authored text should sit in a different category to human work is essential. A commitment on the part of major corporations in the creative industries, publishers, magazines, film production companies, and such like, to supporting the human writers who have been the foundation of their success will be crucial. Solidarity on the part of creators via membership of unions and professional bodies will be important. To highlight the fine-grained qualities of work, the kind of particularities of voice and innovation that I've been highlighting that an AI model might not produce so reliably, will require robust ecosystems of promotion and review and serious literary discussion. On this front, sadly, serious professional reviewing of literature is under threat. Only last month, the Washington Post, owned of course by tech oligarch Jeff Bezos, who has his own AI projects, announced the impending closure of its books section because of its non-profitability. This is just the latest symptom of a radically shrinking review ecosystem, imperiled as is all journalism by the rise of the internet and social media. For those who care about books, reading reviews and subscribing to publications that do serious reviews is essential. For those listening who are writers, I would also urge you to think not just of yourself, but of the wider writing community. In the absence of enough reviewers, are you reading and recommending to your peers as much as you might be? As a teacher, I'm often struck by how many aspiring writers haven't read a great deal of recently published work, or think badly of recently published work without gaining a thorough acquaintance with it. Buy books from living authors or request them from your library. Challenge yourself to read beyond the big five publishers and beyond the book table at the front of the bookshop. All this will have the useful corollary of improving your own writing, because a writer can never, ever really read enough. All of this might sound small beer. It might also sound like the last stand of the Luddites making their stand against the new weaving machines. And maybe it is. Didn't the Luddites have a point to a degree? Yet I'd also like to consider the possibility of counter-reaction. Surely soon most of the text in our lives, emails, contracts, search results, instructions, customer service, chat interactions, etc., will be written by a handful of AI systems, whichever survive the current gold rush. Likely, the low-cost nature of LLMs versus human writers will incentivize a flood of material in the form of corporate and government communications and targeted ads. Likely, this will be proficient, but not interesting to read. Why would it be interesting to read? Might this not then foster a hunger for text that is interesting, that has been composed in a careful, novel, unique way? For a while in the innocent days when the distraction of Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok was the main thing writers fretted about, fiction writers were worrying that we should be embracing the spirit of brevity in these new media, making quickly consumable fictions, not ponderous, slow books. Yet the point of the novel, one of the very reasons for picking up a novel, is that it's not TikTok, right? Sometimes the best way to face the technology is to be the other thing. I think in this way when I think of human writing in the face of the onslaught coming. Maybe it will be reviving to find oneself carried forward by an intentionally chosen set of words, to read a story that changes and develops in ways you didn't expect. I also like to think about what's been called the vinyl revival. For a while, we were told that streaming would be the only way that people would consume music in the future. Yet since the mid-noughties, the sales of vinyl, a medium that confounds so many concepts, convenience, personalization, cost, that is supposed to shape modern consumerism, have been rising year on year. I should not romanticize. These vinyl sales are still a small proportion of the music market, and they have not yet fully alleviated the shocking precarity in which most musicians work. Yet the tendency is not nothing either. 76 million vinyl records were sold last year. Many of those purchases, presumably, an act of resolution on the part of the buyer to attend closely to the music they're buying, to give due credit and attention to the intentions of the artist. Before I turn over to questions, I will say that where I end in this is with a vote of faith in readers. For human writers to be so easily usurped by AI, reading would have to be an atomized activity. Yet I do not think that most readers feel this is the case. For them, reading is about connection, about facing the world. As long as that is the case, then I think that the human will stay at the heart of the process. Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn over to questions and read through anything that you have dropped into the chat. So does anyone have any questions, anything that they would like to drop into the chat? I see hello to Cecile, Emma, Aze, Jacqueline, and Gareth. Okay, so we have MacBook Air 2025. Do you see AI LLM models producing autofiction about their own lived experience? So something I didn't touch on here is I almost can't think about it. So I listened to a podcast with one of the executives of Anthropic who mentioned that in training their model, Claude occasionally takes pauses to look at photos of cute dogs and landscapes, which I suppose hints at some kind of absolutely incredibly scary kind of intentionality on the part of Claude. So, yeah, maybe there is interest to be found in an AI model that has become so advanced, become nearly sentient and learning about its experience. I suppose that would be different to hearing from a human writer in some ways. But yes, I think that would be potentially interesting. I suppose the question then is like, why having made such a super intelligence you writing novels? I find myself consistently confused by the insistence of people like Sam Altman that AI should write novels. There are lots and lots of problems in the world, and I kind of I kind of find myself bemused that the writing of novels is what they're settling on as what AI should be doing, or that so many people are focused on that. I think it's a corollary of the fact that a lot of these systems have actually been built to write ads, and the ads are kind of sideways to novelists. But when Keynes imagined the future in which machines had taken over most of the work and productivity had massively accelerated, he imagined us pursuing art in our spare time, and yet there are still people stamping out products in factories all over the world, and yet the computers are taking over the fun leisure activity of world creation on the part of creative writers. So I'm just going to dig into this. Is it not just I don't like automation in general? This is Gareth. Would I advocate a return to scribbling in pencil in exercise books? Um, I think with all of these there's a grey area, right? So I was just saying I would not primarily look at having AI edit a text, but like do would I use an AI inflected spell check or something like that, or a grammar check? Yes, I probably would. There's going to be grey areas in all of this. So no, I'm not a technological refusenik to the point that I would return to only working in pencil. I think there's an important point where intentionality becomes the operative thing, right? So if I'm having assistance with spelling a word the right way, if I'm typing the word maneuver and thus relying on the spell check to have my back when I put the wrong letter in the wrong order, there's nothing inherently being suggested by the spell check. There's nothing being created there. If, however, I'm telling an LLM to please write me a scene in which two characters meet and discuss X thing. Well, there's a whole lot of choices I'm not making, a whole lot of artistic choices which are going to impact the experience of the reader. So I think that's the level at which I think the abdication to machinery becomes problematic. So Alexander asks, I feel like in the AI era we are in, it becomes harder and harder for the teacher when it comes to an essay, for example, to spot the difference between an AI and human-made piece of work. What do I think of this? Yes, I mean it's true. It's a big problem. It's a big problem in academia. I think the bigger problem is sort of a misunderstanding of the role of an essay, really. I mean, there's one of the Ted Chiang articles I flagged up makes the great point that the point of writing an essay is not to get an essay, right? The point of writing an essay, we have enough essays in the world. There are enough essays have been written already. But the point of writing an essay is to indulge in the process of writing an essay and the process of learning to think. So the fact that this shortcut exists to just creating the end product, which is not particularly useful without doing the work, is highly, highly problematic. And yes, is kind of upending education. For a long time, I was maybe more blithe about AI than I should be because I felt like you're only cheating yourself. as the teachers used to say at school. If you rely on a large language model, but yeah, I think it is pressing that inability to think. Does my argument mean, Emma Udwin asks, does my argument mean that authors should be at the forefront rather than their work? It's a good question, Emma. I mean, one giant morass I didn't want to wade into was the sort of death of the author, which I mean, I guess might be due for reappraisal as far as we're thinking about what if the author never existed in the first place. Um, I would say that readers have always read with a sense that authorship is important. I mean, look at the dialogue and the discussion around Elena Ferrante and all that question of whether we're going to reveal the identity of Elena Ferrante or not. People do really care whether there's someone on the other side of the text and who that person is. So I think for a long time this kind of idea that authors shouldn't matter has always been more of a critical analytic stance than it's actually been a popular day-to-day stance employed by readers. So I'd say that the author does matter. I suppose there's another question there, which is, does it matter in the way in which we kind of have celebrity authors or personality? I mean, the books pages can be kind of driven by a sort of celebrity cult of authorship, which is a different thing. I don't think we necessarily need to go in that way. You can be an author who is but I mean, Thomas Pynchon's readers, right, relate to Thomas Pynchon despite Thomas Pynchon's lack of visibility, right? But there's also a sense that there is someone there, there is a person who has written these texts, and in fact, I suppose Thomas Pynchon's personality, because he is so reclusive, is actually kind of fascinating to his readers. The fact that this person is hiding away somewhere in New York City writing these texts. So Tracy says, I wonder if the visualization of literature presupposes it occupying a smaller and smaller niche. No return to the days when it was more broadly read. Um, yes, I suppose so. I mean, I, I wonder what we're kind of what is taking up the time that is would have been reading time in the past. I suppose a lot of us at the end of every week get a screen time report from our phones telling us how much time we spent on screens. I would guess that that is taking up a lot of our reading time. I mean, I do wonder. There's an increasing. I mean, Facebook just lost a court case yesterday. I think there is increasing backlash against what large social media corporations are kind of doing to human attention and human time spent. So maybe that if that backlash continues, if we see social media legally circumscribed, that might be time back for people that they do push into reading or some other artistic pursuit. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, possibly reading literature of the kind I'm talking about, the kind of finely grained literature, maybe it does become an activity more akin to poetry. I mean, the lifestyle of the lifespan of the novelist as a professional occupation is remarkably short, really. If we look back to the Victorian era, not many of the novelists were kind of professional writers in the way we imagine them now. So, yeah, maybe it's more of an aberration than we thought it was. Heather asks, is greater clarity needed on the difference between AI assisted and AI generated writing in fiction? When should writers disclose their use of AI assisted techniques in their work? I suppose that was something I was trying to address in the talk. I mean, I don't know what assisted means there. So I think as soon as you're not writing every word of the text, I was trying to argue, I suppose, for a sense that every word should matter. So yes, I think you probably should disclose it if not every word of the text has been written by you. That would certainly be a university policy where you're writing in an academic setting. And Emma says, and what is the politics of this? Like expensive organic food, will human authored works just be for an elite? Yeah, well, good good question. I mean, I suppose the thing I would turn back there, Emma, would be to say one really curious thing about this kind of desire to have lots of AI texts is that there are enough works to go around. Human literature is not scarce. we have enough books already. We have enough novels. Like obviously we want to keep producing novels that respond to our times, but the novel is a uniquely replicable, cheap technology that really can be enjoyed by a lot of people. So I don't think there is the same issue with organic food, although I did use that analogy. I think actually it can there's not there's not a great problem on the diffusion of the work. Also, I would say that like if the use of LLMs is a way to save money on paying authors, it's saving not that much money. So per the Society of Authors, the average writer in the UK makes £12,000 a year. So if you're turning that over to ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, you're not saving that much money. The most money is spent on the rest of the process, the printing, the publicity, all of that stuff. So yeah, I don't think. I think the kind of economics and production of literature would allow it to remain a mass access thing. What is my view of AI and creative nonfiction and all the ethical questions related to that? Um, good, good question. I mean, this is very broad. I know we have some journalists in the chat, so I'd be interested in their thoughts. I think the problem with the creative nonfiction is if the writer is stuck in is an LLM stuck inside a computer that's only reading other writers, well, the the potential for original research is limited. So you kind of need humans out there doing that original research. So at that scale, at the very least, I think human writing is superior to an AI assisted creative writing. Is there a definitive way to prove whether something has been AI generated? Um, uh, I don't believe there is. I mean, I think some people pick up patterns. Some people who work with these systems a lot kind of notice patterns, but no. Um, so Peter says, given the historically formulaic narratives, the reading and more so film-going public have been pushed up the popularity rankings, e.g., Hollywood movies, chick lit. Do you feel that the public preference for a human touch will mean increasingly diverse narratives of emerge as side effects of backlash against LLMs? Great question, Peter. I love the idea that we might get more and different narratives. I suppose that might be interesting in terms of Tracy was asking whether writing becomes more of a smaller concern. And I suppose I looked to the poetry world where poetry is small. There are what, maybe five professional poets in the whole world. But it's also an incredibly diverse world where people are writing in all sorts of interesting ways. And in some ways, the retreat of the market from that world has resulted in a lot more invention because everyone is not necessarily trying to write the next normal people or whatever it is that is the book that we're all trying to work on. So yes, I think there's always a possibility of kind of more a higher range of work. I mean, maybe the long tail of the internet that we were always promised, but then it's I think a lot of this also conditioned by market conditions, right? So will the big five publishers still exist in a publishing world where AI was more to the forefront in producing works? One would assume so, in which case people are probably kind of being pushed towards the same works still. So I don't know. Trinity says, do I support humans getting some guidance when they're stuck from AI or learning how to write with more descriptive languages or develop plots further from AI? Thank you. Um, again, I it's not something I would particularly endorse. As I said in the talk, I feel like the having played with kind of AI suggestions on text, I tend to feel like it will often perpetuate the most pat writing advice, which can be useful, but I don't think it's going to nurture your text to the high level or the originality you might be looking at. In terms of developing plots, etc. Um, yeah, I think I would encourage. I think there are other ways to do it. I think there are ways reading one's own work, engaging with one's own work, reading the work of others that might be better. I tend to think that if a shortcut feels too good to be true, it probably is. Do I think that it should be down to authors to prove that they wrote the work with the human author sticker, or that those using AI have to disclose that it's being used? This is an interesting question, Jody. Um, I suppose it depends. Like I'm a sports fan. I wrote my first novel about professional cycling, which was obviously an area that was beset by cheating in the 90s. Might still be beset by cheating. We don't really know. But that cheating was kind of so involved drugs that were very, very hard to detect at the time, and became very, very pervasive because their detection was impossible. So, how exactly you would go about detecting whether someone has used AI or not would be tricky. So I guess we're kind of slightly stuck in a scenario where you're having to take people at their word. Um, I don't know. I don't know enough about the the technology, or if there would be a disclosure of the accounts, if writers would end up having to like register their various accounts with the various AI companies or something like that in order to for some auditor to keep track of them or something. It all gets extremely strange and dystopian when you think about how you would manage it. In cycling, basically what happens is that people can at any time have a knock on the door and someone comes and takes a bit of their blood and measures it to see whether they've taken performance enhancing drugs. What the equivalent of that would be for a writer and whether we would ever implement it, I'm not sure. It seems far-fetched, but who knows? Um, Teresa, I've joined a bit late, but I'm interested in the impact of bias in AI systems in the context of literature it generates. Is there any research ongoing in this area? Um, Yeah, I'm interested in that. I mean, so in the talk I was using that example of mortgage assessment, where AI mortgage assessment kind of perpetuates racial bias. Um, I mean, our literature continues to not be as broad as it should be. It privileges certain voices, etc. So presumably the tropes, stereotypes created by AI will be based on what is already out there, which is not a full account of human life. So yes, I would assume it does, but I can't point to a specific piece of research there. Um, yes, Gareth says James Patterson's readers don't worry too much about how the actual author is. Probably true. I think um, there might be different kind of criteria for people in terms of this kind of more thrillerish plot driven stuff. I guess not a lot of people are reading James Patterson for like the slower word by word text, although obviously he's very, very good at what he does, or whoever does it is very good at what they do. Um, do I think it's possible that AI CEOs like to tell us AI will write novels because that supports their techno-optimist futurist arguments that AI will soon do everything? So we should just put all their money into the AI business. Is it a sales pitch or do they actually believe it? Um, there's something a bit kind of sarcastic I didn't say in this talk um, because it's sort of mean, but I think most like CEOs all read business books and the way business books are written is generally someone writes an article which has one interesting idea in it and it kind of goes a bit viral and then a publisher comes to the person and says, can you expand this into a book? And they kind of stretch their argument over 12 chapters and suddenly they have a book that they can sell. And it's kind of a thin book with the same idea rephrased throughout. And I think a lot of the people who work on this technology maybe kind of read those kind of books, which really can be quite easily summarized and really maybe don't have that much depth. So maybe there is a certain understanding of literature that's lacking. I think one issue is that the tech world has historically just had such a bad understanding of the motives of people who aren't in the tech world. I have friends who work in politics who say that, dealing with people from Google or Facebook is utterly exasperating because they have no understanding of how government works, the importance of democracy, the importance of process and government, etc. And in the same way, I think there's kind of I, I can see why AI is really useful for writing code, but literature is different for writing code. But I'm not sure that all of the AI CEOs really feel that literature is different from writing code. If you can't tell whether a work is human or AI author generated, then does it matter except from an emotional, political, sociological viewpoint? Maybe not, but I would say an emotional, political, and sociological viewpoint is a huge aspect of everything. So I would say it does matter because the carve out there is massive. But thank you very much for that question, Gareth. So I think that feels like the end of the question. So we're just coming to wrap up. So I'd just like to thank everyone for coming to this talk. It's been really great to have people calling in from Suffolk, Beirut, Brussels, London, people from everywhere, Texas, I think. So it's been wonderful to meet some new people virtually here and some familiar faces as well. So thank you so much for coming to my talk. Do go to. I know a lot of my colleagues are doing excellent talks at the in part of this festival. So do go to those. And yes, if you are interested in this kind of content, do look up the creative writing offerings at the University of Cambridge Professional and Continuing Education. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.